It's the bird emergency. We are hoping to make the Monday megaphone a bit of a regular feature, and I'm really pleased. First to tell you that my name's Grant Williams, which I always forget to do. But I've been chasing today's guest for a while. It's been a very busy time for the Policy Analyst from the Australian Conservation Foundation, Mr. James Trezise. Thanks for joining the bird emergency, James. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good, Grant. Thanks for having me on, and apologies for being pretty hard to pin down. As you say, it's been a pretty busy time in the world of national environmental policy.
Well, for anybody who is listening, this is going to be fairly Australia-focused today, so apologies for that. But we've had a process undergoing for, what's it been now, about the last, has it been 9 months since the review started? Okay.
Yeah, about that. Kicked off in October 2019.
So the federal government is undertaking a review of the legislation, the overarching legislation that governs the protection of endangered species and biodiversity in Australia. And the interim report of that review was released in the last, it'd be nearly 2 months ago now, wouldn't it?
End of July.
Yeah, that came out. So, James, could you perhaps walk us through what the review found, what was in the interim review, and then we'll sort of maybe step back about what some of the biggest issues are, and then how confident maybe you are that anything's going to get dealt with.
Yeah, some pretty big issues. I think before you want to jump into the interim review, you probably want to give people a little bit of background about what we're talking about in terms of legislation, because it is a mouthful. It's the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. It's Australia's national environmental law, and it's been in place for 20 years. It was actually introduced by Robert Hill, the Environment Minister under John Howard, back in the year 2000. So, this legislation's been kicking around for 2 decades. This is the second time it's been gone through a statutory review, a review that's been required under the law itself. And the first one that happened around between 2008 and 2009 by Dr. Alan Hawke, it never really got off the ground just by virtue of the politics of that era. That was an era of great upheaval in federal politics and a hung parliament in the lower house. And so, there was a number of recommendations that were put forward then, and, the legislation never really got updated. And what this legislation does is it kind of sets up the framework which governs the way the federal government engages in the environment, pretty much. So it's the legislation that says this is how you list nationally threatened species, all the birds that are on that list. It's the legislation that says how you protect and manage World Heritage Areas. It's the legislation that sets up the management arrangements for places like Kakadu. So it's a pretty important piece of legislation. So it's just had its 20-year review. If I think about where I was back in 2000 and kind of what I was doing 20 years ago, the fact that we've got the same set of environmental protection legislation running since then is a bit scary, not least of which because we've learnt a lot more about what's going on with our natural environment and the challenges that are impacting on it. So, Professor Graham Samuel, he's the bloke who's kicked off the review, or was appointed by the government to look at it, and he released his interim report back in July this year. And basically it found a number of things, but the thing that stood out to me was that he found that Australia's environment is in an unsustainable rate of decline, and that this piece of legislation isn't fit for purpose. It doesn't work for business and it doesn't work for the environment. Often it gets framed up by decision makers like the minister that, we talk about it doesn't work for environment groups. It doesn't work for the environment. We're just there to kind of give voice to what the environment actually needs. And so when we talk about it doesn't work for the environment, there's a whole host of reasons why it doesn't. We can kind of explore those in whatever granular level of detail you'd like, Grant, and stop me if I'm rattling on as well.
Let me just stop you there, because I think people would be amazed to think that we're 20 years down the track and we've had a number of really popular community-driven, people-driven programs like Landcare. I don't think there's any doubt. I don't think any politicians could doubt that people want to hang on to the natural heritage that we have. Now, I've tweeted a number of times to the Threatened Species Commissioner and anyone else who wants to. Can you think of an endangered or threatened bird in Australia that we know, not anecdotally think, but that we can demonstrate has become more plentiful in the wild? I know there's certain species that are probably more plentiful than they were 20 years ago, but most of them are in aviaries. Can you think of one success that we've had under the legislation?
Well, look, I can think of a few, but before you go there, I think you got to divorce. Is it because of legislation or is it because of other drivers?
But isn't that a problem where we say the legislation is meant to protect the species and the habitats that they live in? Now, I don't know how you can say other things are causing the decline. No, we've got laws there that are supposed to protect the species. We've got to hang on to. We've got to stop losing them. I mean, you can look at like the swift parrot and the Regent honeyeater at the moment, where we've had the releases and whatnot, and that's all great news. And I wouldn't dare criticise anyone who's putting in heaps and heaps of effort to save those two birds. And if you're saving those birds at the same time, you're probably saving a whole heap of mammals at the same time, a whole heap of insects and whatnot. But while we're spending a whole heap of money, putting heaps of resources into all sorts of programs to protect them, people are still running a couple of drots, a couple of caterpillars with chains between them, and smashing down the remaining habitat. I just fail to see how that is still happening. It's not like we're not aware.
Yeah, totally. And that's it. Like, one of the biggest drivers of the decline in biodiversity, birds or otherwise, in Australia is destruction of habitat, coupled with invasive species and the growing pressure of climate change. It's a pretty diabolical trifecta, and throw some fire into that mix as we had last summer, and it's not a pretty picture. So, but where I was going with that before was that, we've only seen one species actually move in a positive direction. That means move from a high threat class to a low threat class on our national conservation list due to conservation action. Only one, based on evidence that was provided by the federal government to Parliament last year.
Well, spread the good news.
They didn't even name what that species is, but it's well kind of discussed that that's the humpback whale. Action around the International Whaling Commission has seen, a growth in numbers of those species. Now, we see a lot of movement of species on the threatened species list due to their classification and new information, but not because of prominent conservation action. That's the problem.
But James, what action? This is where I get really annoyed. So the government can say, yes, we've had one species move forward, but let's say the increase in the population of humpback whales is because of what other countries are no longer doing. It's not really because of anything that we are actively doing, other than going to conferences and telling other countries, stop shooting whales.
Yeah, well, I don't want to talk down the importance of multilateral environmental agreements, because I think they are actually
I'm not meaning to do that either. I'm just saying, nobody. You can't say we've had a success because, one, the humpbacks aren't limited to existing in Australia or in Australian waters, so they're a global species. I just think my point stands. I don't think we can demonstrate that we've had a success with one species.
Well, yeah, you're probably right at a species level. I think we see pockets of success. We see, as you kind of rightly identified, captive release of Regent Honeyeaters, BirdLife Australia in partnership with Taronga, and the federal government with orders. There are good news stories in the mix, but at a systems level, at a species level,
do we have more box habitat suitable for the Regent Honeyeater in the last 20 years?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have the numbers, but I would bet my entire savings that there is not more suitable habitat for the Regent Honeyeater and the swift parrot than there was 20 years ago.
Yeah. And so where we land, I think, with that is becomes like, if you contrast what happens with the International Whaling Commission, the humpback whale, or the loss of habitat in Australia, I think it actually boils down to a political equation. So, it's easy for federal politicians in particular to puff up their chest, go overseas and try and make Australia sound like, a conscientious global citizen. But when it comes to actually making decisions on our own soils, there's a whole bunch of vested interests that pile in and really kind of shape or control the way decisions get made. And I don't think you need to look much further than what happened in New South Wales last week around koalas to see that starting to take shape, and that was just insane what happened around New South Wales politics, where one part of the government wanted to blow up the government because they were actually trying to protect koala habitat. And I think there are some probably legitimate concerns in there around the accuracy of mapping and everything, but that didn't warrant the escalation and the tactics that were deployed by one section of that government to try and kind of go nuclear, so to speak, and bring down their own government. And it all just came to power plays. And they wanted to be able to say, no, we want to do whatever we want.
But I think we've got to be even more granular and more specific than that. Two key members, one of them being the leader of the National Party in New South Wales, who were the ones who were saying we're walking away because, as they always did, they drape it in because you're making life hard for farmers, right? The two key members of the government had their personal wealth threatened by a conservation strategy. So we have to start being fair dinkum about this, and we need to start targeting. This is my view. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think conservationists, people who care, have to start pointing out that this politician voted against this, and make it personal in every electorate, in every council election, because it's too easy to say, but I care about the environment. I've supported our environmental laws that don't work. I consistently support action that doesn't work. It's too easy to do it.
Yeah, and on the counter side of that, I think the other part is someone who walks the halls of Parliament and kind of engages with politicians, fairly regularly. I think there's this other side of the coin as well, which is we need to actually cultivate champions, not just within one political party, but across the board, about people who care about the environment. And what I find is that there are people across the political spectrum who actually deeply care about the environment and about wildlife. It just depends on where they sit within their political party about how much they can actually shape those decisions. And so you could imagine if you're someone within The current coalition government at the moment, probably more at the federal level than at the New South Wales level, but certainly at the New South Wales level, we saw some people standing up against the bully boy tactics that some of those people you just mentioned deployed on Friday. And I think that's right. I think what we need to see is, and we need to encourage, is that everyone has their own political bent. Everyone has their, or they're not necessarily. There might be some people who are swing voters and who oscillate, but irrespective of that, there is something common to a lot of us, and I think you touched on it earlier, which is that people care. You talk about the land care movement. You talk about farmers who are deeply proud to have koalas on their property. So they'd be looking at what just happened. They'd be looking at the shit show, basically, that the Nationals unleashed, basically saying that they want to knock over koala habitat willy-nilly. No nuance to their debate, no nuance to their fight at all. And they'd be looking at going in horror, going, what are you guys doing? At the same time, there are people within our political spectrum that care. And I think what we need to do is try and lift those people up. We need to try and encourage them and empower them to speak up and speak out. If we look at what's happening in the federal political situation at the moment, we're not really getting that. So, what we've seen at a federal level in terms of the politics is, those people who don't really care about the environment, and you can see them, we heard the Prime Minister say he addressed the extinction crisis during the election campaign by talking to an animal testing bill. I dealt with that in the last week of sittings, was the comment he made when he got questioned on it. I think the problem we have within federal politics is we're not getting enough people speaking up on these issues. They're not raising these issues, and they're seeing everything, particularly now, through the lens of, an economic frame. How do we restart an economy post-COVID? And a lot of that is being talked about. One of the silver bullets that's being thrown around by the government is, this, cut green tape, which is just, another framing device to talk about environmental protections. But if we bring that back to the EPBC Act, right? So what does that mean? They're going to try and jam through some legislation to make approving projects more quickly when there's a whole bunch of other stuff we know needs to happen to actually protect biodiversity, protect the environment, protect water resources, protect world heritage. And I think until we actually start to break down some of these power structures within, not just within society, but within political parties as well, that say that, we don't see champions for the environment kind of being able to express their voice, or that they get shut down. And, and I think that's a serious concern, because I keep saying that people keep coming to me, particularly in the political class, and saying, well, we have an economic crisis. And I keep turning around and saying, well, we actually have an environment crisis as well. We have a biodiversity and a climate crisis. And there is a narrative around, cutting green tape. The reality is cutting the EPBC Act and approval timeframe is going to pretty much do bugger all for the economy. It's all modelling around the time delay between a state approval and a federal approval. They call it net present value, and blah, blah, blah. It's all technical, but it's not real money. But there is a physical reality of what's going on in our environment, where species are going to start disappearing quickly, where the reef is going to start dying, and it is dying at a more rapid rate. And we're going to start to see these things escalate and accelerate. And that is the physical reality. And that is a level of disruption that our politics is not equipped to deal with. And so what's going to happen is, as that level of disruption accelerates, community is going to become more concerned, more agitated, and we're going to start seeing more protests and more, social disruption, more business disruption, because our government isn't treating this concept of environmental sustainability as part of a cohesive and sustainable democracy and society. And I think these are the things that aren't getting dealt with in our political and our public service class, to be quite frank. They don't grapple with these issues, and they view sustainability as something that sits over there. The greenies can go deal with that, where the adults are just going to sit here and talk about how to dig a new mine, build a new piece of pipeline, gas at the moment if you're in Canberra. So I think that's a real big challenge for how we start to break through. And it's actually something that Graham Samuels kind of also touched on in his review, if we want to bring it back to that.
Now, let's sort of get more into that in a second, but as working as a policy analyst for the ACF, I wonder if you'd agree with this, or if you think that sort of my thinking here has any sort of value for future action. I studied horticulture in the mid-90s and worked in horticulture and in land care for a while. And the same kind of arguments to stop conservation, shall we say, keep being trotted out. But we don't seem to have, on the conservation side of the ledger, on the preservation side of the ledger and the biodiversity and the research side of the ledger, we haven't seemed to grapple with using economics as a weapon. Like, have you been to the Hillsville Sanctuary down here in Melbourne?
Driven past it.
When I was a kid, the thing that they marketed was that they had platypuses that bred in captivity. And I reckon those platypus were the economic underpinning of that venture in the 70s and 80s. I wonder whether we've really done the work to value what every platypus, not individual platypus, here's a platypus in my hand, but platypus being visible in the Yarra River and you being able to reliably go to the upper reaches of the Yarra on a weekend and see platypuses. I don't think we are calculating the economic value that people have in platypus, lyrebirds. I mean, every species you could do this for, and you could say, hang on, this is what our environment is worth to us in local, regional, and international tourism. I mean, how many people would come to Australia compared to they're sitting in their flat in Seoul, let's say, and they're working out their family holiday for 10 people, and all of a sudden we've got no koalas left in the wild, and no kangaroos left in the wild, and we've got no emus left in the wild. How many of those people are going to take a bus tour going through regional New South Wales?
That's right.
They're just not going to go. So,
well, yeah.
You know.
And the thing with it is, right, like most people who come to Australia, and this comes to your COVID recovery and everything else, right, most people who come to Australia, they come for our natural environment. It's like well established. The main draw card for our international tourism industry is our natural environment, our wildlife, places like the reef. That's why people come here. They don't come to go and they might stop by, have a look at the Opera House, look at the Harbour Bridge in Sydney, and check out Melbourne Federation Mall, but they're here to see our natural wonders. And so whilst that might not be happening now because of COVID, all this crap about cutting green tape, it's not going to do much for the people who are most impacted by what's going on right now. Like, they're going to want people coming back, and those people are going to want to come back if we have a thriving natural world. We're not going to have a thriving natural world if we're cooking it.
But we're so good at quantifying the dollar value of the tourism industry as a whole, and that tourism groups in specific sectors are able to put a value on their sector of the industry. Now, are you aware of any reliable sort of valuing methodology that includes social value and all that kind of stuff?
Oh, yeah.
Well, why don't we trot that out more often? Because I remember working on a project where street trees in all sorts of municipalities were being valued. We're given, gum trees that were 25 years old, we're given values of hundreds of thousands of dollars, so that if you plotted out the value of your mature eucalypts in your public space, it would be was, hundreds of millions of dollars in certain municipalities. So the greening of the suburb was given a value which was then reflected in real estate values and economic generation generally. I think we've really dropped the ball by not being able to counter all of these pro-development arguments with a pro-don't develop argument. A status quo is actually worth more than knocking down your 28 acres of woodland or whatever that you want to put some rice in or some sorghum in. That we should be able to outweigh the because I'm not aware of any work that does that. Are you?
Yeah, well, there's actually quite a lot, and the latest one is kind of called the Natural Capital Protocol. But there's also a really large study coming out of the UK Treasury. There's a number of different methodologies.
Actually, I should have said I'm aware of it in other parts of the world. I'm not aware of anyone doing it here, so that we can slap someone around with a thing going, "This is about the value of the wildlife in New South Wales, mate."
Yeah. But so on that, so there's two parts, right? So one is your methodology, and you got your system of environmental economic accounts, and you've got this thing coming out of the UK Treasury, the Descoupta review. You've got your National Capital Protocol, which is actually being kind of deployed here, and there've been discussions federally here for quite some time on trying to, value kind of what you'd call ecosystem service provision. And that includes your kind of concepts of your social values, your regulatory values, your economic values. So there's all these different kind of values that the environment does for us. So from pollinators and the value of native and non-native pollinators to crop production, for example.
Yeah.
So it's been tried, if you Google ecosystem services and try and understand what the feds have tried to do around a policy framework around that, it's kind of also the basis for trying to set up a system of national environmental accounts, because you need to start to measure it before you can make the policy case. But the reason why, so in a direct answer to your question, I don't know if you remember, there was a study done by Deloitte. Pretty sure it was Deloitte.
Those radical left-wing conservationists, Deloitte.
Yeah. About the economic values provided by the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah.
And it's about 3 or 4 years old now, or maybe even older. And I can't talk to it directly because it's not top of mind, but it's definitely been done, where they tried to quantify the economic outputs of a healthy, resilient reef. The problem that I see, and my background is one of public service policy. I was public servant for 6 years before I joined ACF. And my general take is that those kind of methodologies, the ones that you're talking about where we start to value the economic contribution of the environment to our society, and you can do that through, well-being, through, regulating temperatures in urban treescapes like you talk about, mental health benefits. How many people are just craving nature, particularly in Victoria at the moment because of the lockdown? So there's all these kind of benefits that we get from the environment. And my take is that the people that make the kind of key economic decisions in our government, they don't give much credence to those arguments. So, for example,
so it really comes
in federal treasury,
they don't care.
Exactly. They just don't care, and they don't buy into the economic arguments. I guess it's the same thing as what you start to see in the division between the economic kind of academic community or the economic analyst community around modern monetary theory. I'm not going to go there. Don't worry. But there's this kind of division. It's a similar thing where they just look at kind of mechanisms to start valuing the environment, and they just kind of look at it and go, yeah, whatevs. But that being said, I think there are some really savvy farmers who get it. They get that a healthy environment is critical to their business model. And there's other sectors. And so it's not going to be driven by government. I don't think it's going to be driven by...
But here's the frustration. I know that the farmers get it. Most of them get it. But who's the biggest bloody landholder? It's not little farmers. It's not the family farm. It's bloody Homes of Court and all the big pastoral companies who are only looking at the balance sheet. And so they, I just don't know how we've got nowhere in 20 years. I mean, I despair. It's why I'm doing the podcast, because I just and look, I don't know if my sort of suggestion is still too early, but we're too bloody nice to the opponents of keeping things standing. Like we always value a report handed to us by an industry that says this industry is worth this much and creates this many jobs. So the timber industry can slap down a report and everyone takes it seriously. But you can point to 150-year-old eucalypt and say that's worth, as a street tree, that would be worth $280,000 on its own. And everyone goes, oh, that's all airy-fairy bullshit, mate. That's, how do we get more muscle into the arguments? Because I fear the days of consistently getting 70,000 people to a street protest are gone.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. So like I said before, if you go back to the heart of it, you ask why not focus on the economic arguments of it. And so the reason, I think, is because the economic arguments work for a certain audience. The economic arguments work for your decision-maker audience. And while your decision-maker audience is sitting there going, we don't give a shit, you're kind of shouting into the empty space. So once your decision-making audience starts to engage on those issues, and we see it from time to time, but not really now, and you see maybe with the current head of Treasury there, Stephen Kennedy's, he's kind of got a mind for some of these things, but certainly not previously, and certainly not out of the PM's office, then it's not something that motivates people. It's people don't sit there and go, I care about this issue because of its economic value.
No.
People care about birds. People care about wildlife because they actually just care about these things. We're taught about them from a young age. My kids have got a whole bunch of stuffed koalas, stuffed platypuses, stuffed thylacine even. And so there is an inherent care and love of nature. So that's what motivates people. So I think you're right that we won't get 70,000 people out once we start talking to people about the economic arguments. And so, if you hit to the rub of it, the nub of it, we don't have a decision-making class engaging on these issues. And the reason we don't have a decision-making class engaging on these issues is because we've got a disengaged and disenfranchised constituency. And then what we need to do is get people from a broad cross-section of backgrounds engaging in the concept of conservation. And that can be through doing things like land care. That can be doing things through like writing to their MP. Can be doing things like engaging in a street protest. What has happened, I think, probably since about 2015 there's a much stronger focus on the extinction crisis that we're facing, and that is getting more traction and currency across not only Australia but the world. We're certainly not there yet, but as I was kind of alluding to, my take on everything is it's going to build up. The pressure is going to continue to build up because of the sheer physical reality that we're facing. The fact that lyrebirds might now be a threatened species because of the summer's bushfires. The fact we've probably got less than 400 region honeyeaters left in the wild, and these species are going to disappear. We've seen 3 species of vertebrates in Australia go extinct in the past decade. So these are all things that people are starting to grapple with now, and they are going to create a pressure that is going to be very difficult for decision makers to avoid. And the way they try to avoid it at the moment, the strategy that's being deployed by politicians is to go and announce a little project here and a little project there. They take that and they blow it up on social media, and they try to make big headlines about it. And I think the challenge for us as conservationists is to say, yeah, that's great at a local scale, but we've got a system in decline and a natural environment that's kind of starting to collapse around us. The interesting thing that I'd say is that, in my experience, the biggest change I've seen probably in a couple of years is engagement from the business community. And that's driven by 2 things. One, it's driven by a genuine, I think, concern for the direction of the planet, and that is driven by some of those responsible businesses, I guess you'd call them, that take their obligations quite seriously. But the second, and I think more powerful one, is being driven by consumers and customers. And there's a big kind of thing. We're citizens and we're consumers, and people are demanding businesses take more responsibility. And so whilst my take on it is government's going to be kind of one of the last mobs to come to the table on this, they're going to be sitting there waiting and watching, and they're pretty much going to get, they're going to be sitting there with probably the rear guard of the business community who just want to destroy the planet to make a buck. But they're going to be surrounded by a whole host of other responsible business entities, a broad swathe of the community, NGOs and others. And also I think, when we haven't really engaged on it, but we absolutely have to acknowledge the First Nations peoples and their connection to country and what's happened to this country since colonisation. But they're just going to be surrounded by, everyone demanding action. And once that happens, it'll as my CEO often tells us, it can feel like you're pushing shit uphill for a while, but when change happens, it happens fast. And I think that's what we'll find around conservation, that there is going to be some pretty dramatic step changes that are going to either address the challenge, or we're going to see some pretty dramatic step changes that are going to see biodiversity diminish rapidly. Yeah. And either way, life's going to come at us pretty fast in this space.
Let me lob a hand grenade at you, because again, I'm feeling pretty militant. It's Militant Megaphone Monday. I constantly get annoyed when there seems to be no consequences for the actual people involved in the decisions that reduce habitat and reduce biodiversity. So that when we hear of, let's talk about, again, Region Honeyeater, Swift Parrot, where the box woodlands are being cleared. And if you look into it, where the clearing happened, and you look at the application, and it'll be bloody blah company, owned by bloody blah holdings, owned by bloody family trust. So there's a level of shielding for the actual individuals who are behind it. And my view is that we need to stop being nice. We need to stop publishing that it's bloody company applied for this. We need to say John and Wilma Smith and their 3 kids, who are all aged under 4, are the people who have actually applied for this and are carrying out the work, and it's actually their family farm. I think we have to start getting that granular to shake some action, as the Flaming Groovies would have said. It's too easy to be the bad guy. An awful lot of these development works that applied for that diminish habitat are by small family farmers who are also taking grants for erosion control in other parts of their property and things like that. I just think it's time to say, which hat are you going to wear? Are you wearing the white hat or the black hat? Or even you're wearing the grey hat, but I'm sorry, the grey hat isn't good enough. The grey hat still makes you bad.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of challenges with that. I think that is probably a very militant approach.
Well, we're used to being nice. People are used to being nice, but nobody's nice to their neighbour who leaves their car bodies on the nature strip. No one worries about dobbing them in and complaining and making a fuss. And you see what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. I think when the biggest challenge, if we go back to the challenge we have and a lack of constituency, and the way forward on addressing some of these issues is going to be around bringing communities along. So I think you're going to have you've always got, in a regulatory system, you've always got your bad eggs who are doing bad things, whether you call them out at an individual level, or probably won't go there because there's a whole bunch of privacy issues. But absolutely, people need to be held to account.
Oh, no, hang on. Let me just stop you there. What's the privacy issue if I can track down who the directors are and who the landowners are? What's the privacy issue? It's a public register. You might have to pay $50 to find the names out, but it's a public register. You shouldn't be shielded. Yeah. You shouldn't be shielded like by, I don't want people to know. But I don't want people to know that I've knocked down 45% of the standing timber on my farm.
So I reckon, and just hear me out.
I'll hear you out now.
So that approach, right, if I was just to take a comparator, that approach was the approach that was kind of adopted by a mob called Aussie Farms around animal welfare. Now, Aussie Farms kind of shredded its social license. So, it talks to a particular constituency in particular community. Was this
the animal welfare elf who were trespassing on
they
property?
also trespassed. But the first thing they did was they published a map. The first thing they did. And, where you go when you start doing, like, what you described is you alienate people. And you alienate people that are the people that you want to try and... They're actually, like, a lot of these people, like the way you described it, your mum and dad farmers, they actually care in a lot of circumstances, and that's why I was trying to differentiate. You got your people that care, you got your people that don't. And by bagging them all together and saying all these farmers are bad and they're bad eggs, you shoot yourself in the foot, probably in a more vital organ than that. And that's what basically the Nats just did before. On the other side, they went and said, we're standing up for farmers and all farmers want to chop down koala trees. And I think there's a much more nuanced approach. And yes, there's a huge issue there. There is a huge issue with both the mix of regulation and incentives for protecting habitat. So if you were to ask me what's the solution for box gum woodland, which you take this as it's not about kind of honing in and taking an approach which says individual farmers need to be, wrapped over the knuckles, because that's the approach that we've tried for a long time, and it every reaction generates an equivalent and opposite reaction. And so what happens is you get a political pendulum that swings and a regulatory pendulum swings.
Yep.
And what we need to do is bring people along for a journey. And there's a whole bunch of ways to do that. One of those ways is by trying to explain to people that the environment, and protecting the environment isn't necessarily adverse to your interests. The other way is making a very sound and strong policy case, and you'll be unsurprising to find that we sit in rooms with mob like NFF, National Farmers Federation, and others kind of saying, we need more dollars in the mix to incentivise farmers for delivering conservation outcomes. There needs to be absolutely regulatory safeguards. We need to be not allowing people to knock over important habitats. But until you have incentives in that mix, until you have something where farmers look at it and landowners look at it and go, well, actually, like, all I'm getting is, because this is the narrative, right? This is the narrative that gets spun out into the regions. Inner city urban elites are telling you how to manage your farm, and they're telling you they're locking up your land and stopping you making money. And that's it. That's all they do. That's the Nats kind of whole modus operandi, and enabled by a whole bunch of, farm lobbies. But there's a nuance to that. And this is where I talk about common ground, because there is a lot of common ground. And that is, you need a regulatory safeguard.
I just have to have some latte.
Yeah, no worries. soy macchiato.
Organic.
You and Carlton, just making sure. But, the ultimate challenge for a cohesive society and is breaking apart some of those interests. There's a lot of political interest and self-interest. The one thing I'll always agree with Corey Bernardi on, always back a horse named self-interest. There's a lot of self-interest in the work that a lot of lobby groups do and a lot of political organisations do to polarize our communities. And that polarisation, we end up starting to look like the US. And the challenge that even for organisations like the one I work for is to not fall into that trap and to try and bring people together And the way to bring people together is find where is the communal, the common interest. So we've kind of gone a long way from EPBSAT, but it's directly related, because for the mum and dad farmers, for those agricultural regional landscapes, we need to have the right mix of incentives in the system. And those incentives can look like a whole bunch of different things. It doesn't have to just be government money. It can be, we've done a lot of policy work about fixing your tax system, because at the moment your land care tax rebate that you can claim is, if you're doing a whole bunch of fence work, you can claim that as a tax offset. But if you're doing a whole bunch of conservation work, it actually doesn't meet half the criteria.
Yeah.
And so if you start planting incentives in the system for people to do the right thing, as opposed to just trying to approach them with a stick all the time, don't get me wrong, the regulatory stick is important, but there needs to be this other bit of the system. Then you start actually moving the debate forward. And I think that's what we've kind of missed in the past kind of 15 years in this debate, is that sensible conversation that avoids polarising.
Yeah. I really take that point on board, because I think one of the opportunities we've missed is that we've allowed conservation works on farms to be appropriated into works that are really just damage repair or damage amelioration. And we've allowed the word conservation to be put onto that. Now, that's not conservation work, that's repair work. Conservation work is leaving your remnant vegetation and not overgrazing it. That's conservation work. Or planting more, re-establishing habitat. That's conservation work. Making sure that your existing washaway doesn't get worse, to me, is not conservation. It might be water quality work, but it's not actually conserving. It's certainly not environmental conservation. And we've let the terms all get mashed into one to make farmer appropriate welfare sound green. I guess that's, and I'm not criticising the tax offsets and whatnot. They're absolutely necessary. That's why land care was so popular. But so many projects on land care, and I know because I used to administer quite a lot of them, is that your measure of success was often, we would tick off a project as successful if I produced a brochure, we had children come to our tree planting day, and someone spoke at a school. It had nothing to do with the percentage of survival rate of the 25,000 plants that we put in the ground. So you don't actually make a success marker anything that was difficult to do.
No, that's right. And that's a big critique of program design, right, of land care. Talk with my colleagues about, it's great and it's lovely that there's a, local community vegetable garden that's been kind of funded, but, that's kind of funding that's been done at the expense of probably resourcing, a threatened ecological community restoration or,
Absolutely.
planting new threatened species habitat. And that's done because, often these things, you bring them back into the political frame, they're done for political means and political purposes. And it looks great. Cutting a ribbon in the local paper for a politician at the local veggie garden or whatever the thing is in the community.
They're done because they're popular and they're easily achieved. It's like you can have one electorate officer set something up, set up a couple of meetings and divert $8,000 somewhere and success, done.
Yep,
Yep.
That's right. And so, goes to the broader challenges. And so at the end of the day, I just keep coming back to is, things move on this issue when people demand it moves and when you have a broad-based constituency around it. And so if you have people demanding that, species don't go extinct and that there's relevant conservation action, the biggest challenge we find, though, in that work, like we're one of the few environmental organisations that runs an investigations program, is finding out what's actually going on and, and providing the level of detail and analysis that says, well, actually, this is how you need to prioritise your spending. This is where the money's actually going. We did analysis that kind of got picked up a few years ago, which found a whole bunch of the threatened species funding that was meant to be developed, deployed under Green Army. It was going to things like the shipworks in Melbourne and restoring Old Melbourne Jail, and they were all branded as threatened species funding projects because all they did was, for those projects, they just drew a map around the area, ran a report and said, these are the threatened species that occur in that area. You know, it doesn't matter if they're building a path up in the Gold Coast. They argue that it benefited a whole bunch of threatened species for in the Gold Coast. I was like, mate, you're building a path. It's not a threatened species project.
Well, I'm going to invite you now. I'd love to talk to you in a podcast episode, not so much one of our the live Monday megaphones, about the investigations that you do and what you find. Let's see if before we run horribly out of time, what do you think are the sort of handful of main threats that are facing Australia? Let's say the birds, animals, and plants of Australia, and what perhaps the three most effective things that an individual can do to make a difference today?
It's a tricky one. So, main threats. So the threats are easy because they're well documented, right? So, you know, destruction and loss of habitat, invasive species, close behind, and then, you know, fire/climate change is the third major threat to Australia's wildlife and biodiversity. So, you know, they're all, you know, threats that can be addressed and managed,
and we all know them. So,
yeah,
and that's really the point. That's really the point of asking that way. Everybody knows it. So
the things that I like, you know, there's a whole host of actions that, and they can feel overwhelming at an individual scale. So, you know, if I was to say, what are the things we need to do? We need to protect the critical habitats of places that they're going to need now and into the future, and we need to invest in species recovery and managing those threats, and that includes investing in invasive species. So translate to what people can do right now, write to your local MP. Because I don't know if you remember at the beginning of this, we talked about we need local champions.
Yep.
The biggest thing you can do is write to your local MP and push them to be a champion for birds, for our wildlife, for nature, and relate it to your local patch. Like, it's not hard. The politics is always local. And so the more they hear from their local constituents about issues that matter to them, the more they're forced to react. Write to them about those issues. You know, we need stronger national environmental laws that include protections for critical habitat and climate refuge. We need you guys to start investing in addressing the key threats. So, you know, add some detail on what you want them to do, and put some requests in there as well. So, because they're going to write you back a letter, but you need to ask them to do something. Raise it in caucus, raise it on the floor of Parliament. You know, every MP gets a couple of minutes during sittings where they can raise community matters of community interest if they want to. You know, ask them to put something on the Hansard for you. Ask them to come and meet you and talk about your concerns. Ask them to come out and go on a bushwalk with you. They love getting out of the office and come and see nature. Once people start connecting with nature, they start to engage more. So there's,
ask them to front up for the bird emergency.
Civil responsibilities, so to speak.
Yeah. Ask them to agree to appear on the bird emergency, because none of them.
Yeah, I'll ask them to do that.
None of them will.
New South Wales, ask them to write a letter to Gladys Berejiklian saying that you wanted to stand up for koalas.
James, you mentioned sort of before we right at the outset, you mentioned that because you're dealing with many of the movers and shakers, the public servants and the politicians of all shades, who can you point to as an environmental champion? I'm gonna say that even though my political stripes have been a different colour, I've been hugely impressed with how public Matt McKeon, the New South Wales Environment Minister, has been.
Absolutely.
He's been prepared to be very public on things that you never would have seen a Liberal Environment Minister do in the last 20 years. And so shout out to him. But I mean, the Greens are a bit obvious, aren't they? But who can you point to on both sides of the House, anywhere in the country, who is a politician?
You're asking a dangerous question for me to entertain.
What I'm really looking for, James, is that are there more of the politicians who are other than the Greens who are actually prepared to nail their cloth to the mast?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, we've talked about one, a New South Wales Environment Minister. Good on him.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, I think New South Wales, Matt Keane has been a breath of fresh air in terms of environmental politics, mainly because he has stood up and taken the fight into his cabinet, and we disagree with him on a whole bunch of issues, but he is someone who's prepared to actually stand up and be a champion for his portfolio, for the environment, and he does that with enthusiasm. And I think, you see that from time to time. In a lot of cases, though, I guess what we've seen has been an aversion to speaking up and acting on the environment at a federal level after the last election. And I think that some wrong lessons have been learned out of that. I've been particularly impressed by people like Josh Wilson in federal Labor, who, is continually just making the case that, environment needs to be better protected. Just have a quick squeeze at his Twitter handle. And it was heartening to see, people like Anthony Albanese stand up and talk about the extinction crisis. It was heartening to see, the new environment spokes for Labor, Terry Butler, to stand up and champion the environment. Whether that continues, like whether they're going to be there, I think they're really nervous about the jobs versus environment kind of frame. I can't see anyone really in the coalition standing up at the federal level for the environment. I had some hope for the Environment Minister, and maybe she can take the fight in, but the recent legislative amendments to the EPBC Act that rushed to remove national oversight, the gagging of debate in Parliament, they all send terrible signals about that. And so there is a lot of work to do to recruit champions across the board. And as you mentioned, you mentioned the Greens, and the Greens are quite easy and traditional supporters at the federal level. Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, I think, is a strident advocate for the environment, as well as Senator Janet Rice. And Larissa Waters, of course. So it's kind of tricky, right? But I think my take on politicians is they move when their constituencies demand they move. Yeah. And so, the more we are vocal into our local MP offices, the more we are vocal in terms of demanding, our politicians at state, federal, and even local levels do something, the more we will find those champions start to emerge, and that's not to say that they're not in there. It's not to say any of the people that I mentioned, aren't willing to be more strident in their advocacy. It's just that there are probably other powers that are suppressing those views or voices, For every, I often say to people when they talk about what it's like trying to kind of, lobbying or, doing advocacy in Parliament at the moment, it's very different because, all the passes have been shut down. You can't actually walk in there. But for every one kind of environmentalist walking in trying to have a meeting with an MP, there's, 10 or more industry paid lobbyists walking in telling them to do the complete opposite thing. There's a lot more money, there's a lot more sophistication. Every year the Minerals Council put on their big soiree, the big song and dance, and they have a big dinner. And there isn't that kind of same, all the forest industry, all the industry associations put on a big song and dance in Parliament to woo decision makers. And, the fact is environment organisations don't have the resources to kind of do that kind of stuff. And, it's probably not the best spend, where we're out there trying to save species and do other things. So it is a challenge, but the more people are vocal, and I often kind of fall back on the fact that we've got the biggest asset on our side, which is nature. We've always got kind of these compelling and engaging things to go and talk to people about, which is a bit more exciting. I said it the other day in a meeting, you ask a punter on the street, what do they love more, a koala or a coal mine? I think it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned dealing with industry, or that it's a pretty stark line between, you've got the environmental lobbying, which has got maybe 1/20th of the numbers of foot soldiers, shall we say, who are out there rubbing shoulders with the politicians. Apart from the money, how many? I mean, you meet these industry dudes, don't you?
From time to time.
And are there any that you are aware of who do you think have a genuine concern for the track we are on in terms of environmental destruction?
I'm going to have to take that one a notice, I reckon. So I think there are some signs that are emerging that I have found surprising, to be frank. But basically, the proof will be in the pudding in how they respond and how they engage into what's going on right now with the EPBC review. The way I describe this review is my take on it at the moment, the moves by the government is it's friendless. There aren't many people across the environment and or business sector who are really lining up to support the government on what it's trying to do right now. Business wants a social license. Business wants to know that it can go and do stuff and that it's not going to have a massive campaign against it. Now, if they see windback of environmental protections, they know that anything that gets approved under that regime is going to lack a social license. They're going to be very concerned about that. So I think the proof will be in the pudding about how business reacts and how some of those industry groups respond to the move to kind of both, if you can kind of find a sweet spot, I guess, in terms of the EPBC Act, the environment laws that we started off talking about, between delivering an efficient process, but also delivering one that genuinely protects the environment and empowers communities. There is a potential for a win in that situation. Business is engaging and concerned is the way I think about it. And certainly constituent members of those business groups are concerned. If we talk about big four banks and, a lot of other industry associations, we just talk about have a look at what happened to the CEO of Rio Tinto, right? So that was something that it was approved under.
What's going to happen? He's still driving the bus for another 4 months or something.
Oh, is he? I haven't caught up with that.
All those resignations are resignations for, I think, February or later. It's not like they quit and they stopped straight away. That none of those directors were given the boot when they tendered their resignation. They're all still there.
Yeah, right. But there'll be a lot of CEOs in a lot of businesses looking at that, and just to draw the correlation, which is that was a project that was approved under existing laws. That was a project that ticked all the regulatory boxes, so to speak, disgracefully so. Yeah. But it was out of step with social norms, and it was out of step with societal expectations. And so even though they ticked all their regulatory boxes, they were operating within a failed and dysfunctional system, and they failed their moral and ethical duties. And that's why those people have lost their jobs, and noting what you've just said. And I think business is watching that, and they're also watching what's going on and going, well, if this system becomes cooked, if this system becomes just about removing environmental protections, then who's the next CEO that goes? Who's the next set of directors? Who's the next ones that gets a shareholder revolt when you knock over the last patch of region honeyeater habitat, or you destroy part of a Ramsar wetland, et cetera. So I think there are, the proof will be in the pudding.
Yeah.
But keen to watch.
You raise the issue of the social license, and I want to sort of finish here, James. Do you think that if the government an extremist standpoint and they act against all of these subtle indicators that they should perhaps not be so deleterious in their approach to the environment, with the advent of the opportunity with the review, do you think that sovereign risk will be something that a lot of people will say, well, actually, we've entered into these projects, but we know that there's no real social license backing them, and that sovereign risk might stop being the get out for everything, that you might find a future government emboldened to say, no, we're withdrawing all of the approvals and that's it. We're putting a stop to these projects and that's that.
I couldn't imagine a future government doing that, to be completely honest, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, I guess, just because, the sovereign risk the liable risk for a government would be too big. Not forgetting that my background was once upon a time public servant, so, kind of familiar with some of the way government thinks and is advised on these issues. But I think business will be concerned. Like if you look at climate, we've cooked climate policy in this country for so long, and it's actually been, what's starting to shape climate policy and investment is business decisions, investment decisions, investor activism, shareholder activism, divestment movement. And so that's how your social risk starts to come into your business risk and your calculations around it. And so in a similar way, as we see businesses that don't adopt a more sustainable approach, and this is why I, hedge my bets on where the business community is at, because, these are kind of what they've said to us, is, they can see the writing on the wall that as they lose their social license, they're going to be far more susceptible to these kind of shareholder and investment activism type decisions, and they're going to have to deal with it. And it would make life much easier for them if they had a sensible government policy that actually protected the environment, God forbid. But, let's wait and see.
And of course, the business weighs it up with, can we afford to lose koalas? No. Can we afford to lose the orange-bellied parrot? Probably. It's just an oversized budgie, as Jeff
and then there's also
said.
Businesses that also do a compliance versus non-compliance cost association. So we always think that business wants to apply by the law. That's not how they work. They actually do a risk framework. And what's the penalty if we go in breach?
Well, that's right. I mean, Rio Tinto have got examples all around the world where they've pushed it to the limit, failed the system, and then had to spend billions and billions compensating people.
Well, I'll tell you the way around that. I have to leave you on this one. The way around that is everything in environmental is usually done in terms of compliance through civil enforcement. So, it's like they cop a fine. Yeah. Flip that to direct criminal liability.
That's right.
And you will find that the companies, and it goes to your point before, actually, once you make the
individual responsibility, make the directors and the general managers criminally liable for the damage they cause, and personally,
you will find them paying very close attention.
Yep, absolutely right. Absolutely right. I mean, water policy, David Littleproud. Let me say no more. Yeah. So James, thank you so much for being a part of the bird emergency. I am going to invite you on to do a podcast rather than a stream, because I'd really like to know about how you approach investigations and then what happens when you've completed an investigation. So if you're up for that, I'll hit you up in a month or so.
No worries, mate. Take it easy.
Thanks so much. James Trezise, Policy Analyst with the Australian Conservation Foundation here in Australia, and I don't know whether we've come away being positive or whether we're still glum-faced.
Thanks, mate. Somewhere in the middle. See ya.
Bye.